At first, it sounded like a violation, not a breakthrough, not an innovation, not the kind of discovery that would one day be spoken about with admiration. To the men in headquarters, it was tampering. It was indiscipline. It was a mechanic and a pilot thinking they knew better than engineers, manuals, and generals who had signed off on procedures written far from the front. But out over the Pacific, at altitude, with the sun burning white off the clouds and the fuel gauges falling with every minute, the rulebook felt very different. Inside the narrow cockpit of a P-38 Lightning, a pilot did not hear policy. He heard engines. 2 Allison engines turning on either side of him. 2 streams of vibration coming through the frame. The smell of hot oil, sweat, oxygen, gun lubricant, and salt air. The faint rattle of loose metal somewhere behind the instrument panel. The steady hum of a machine that was supposed to carry him across hundreds of miles of ocean, find the enemy, fight, survive, and still have enough life left to bring him home. Below him was not Europe, with fields and roads and towns. It was water, blue, endless, indifferent water. And somewhere ahead, beyond the haze, Japanese fighters were climbing. The men who flew in the Southwest Pacific understood a truth that never appeared cleanly on a briefing chart. The enemy did not need to shoot you down to kill you. Distance could do it. Weather could do it. A wrong heading could do it. An engine running too hot could do it. A few gallons too little could turn victory into a slow descent toward the sea. Command believed procedure was protection. They believed that factory settings existed for a reason, that engines had limits, that unauthorized changes could ruin aircraft and kill pilots before the Japanese ever had a chance. And often, they were right. A fighter was not a toy. One wrong adjustment could detonate a cylinder, seize an engine, or turn a takeoff roll into wreckage at the end of a muddy strip. But the front line had its own logic. If the official way brought men back on fumes, if it forced fighters to break off before the battle was decided, if it left pilots choosing between chasing the enemy and saving enough fuel to return, then obedience itself became dangerous. That was the contradiction. The generals saw discipline. The mechanics saw empty bunks. On the ground, under the wings of the Lightning, men worked in heat so thick it seemed to cling to their skin. Their shirts were dark with sweat. Their hands were black from oil and dust. Mosquitoes moved in clouds around fuel drums and canvas tents. Somewhere nearby, a generator coughed. Farther off, another aircraft turned over with a hard metallic bark. The modification did not look like history. It did not arrive with ceremony. It was not presented to a committee. It did not come stamped with approval. It came in the form of small changes made by men who had watched missions stretch too far, watched engines punished too hard, watched good pilots land pale and shaking because the last 10 minutes of flight had been made on hope. There may have been a wire. There may have been a valve. There were certainly new settings, new habits, new ways of nursing more distance, and more usable performance out of an aircraft that was already being asked to do the impossible. The exact details would be debated, exaggerated, remembered differently by different men. But the meaning was clear enough. The front line was rewriting the rules. Imagine the moment before takeoff. The pilot climbs into the cockpit. He lowers himself into a seat that feels too small for the weight of what is coming. The canopy slides shut. Outside, a crew chief leans against the side of the aircraft for one last check. Their eyes meet briefly. Neither man says much. They both know what has been done. They both know what headquarters might say if it failed. The engines come alive. The Lightning begins to roll. Dust rises behind the twin booms. The wheels hammer over rough metal matting. The runway seems too short, the jungle too close, the morning too hot. Then the aircraft lifts, heavy and vibrating, into a sky that will decide whether the forbidden fix was genius or madness. That is where this story begins, not in a laboratory, not in a polished office, but between regulation and survival. Because in war, the first side to understand reality often gains the advantage, and the last side to admit it pays in blood. But to understand why anyone would risk punishment for a few extra minutes of performance, we have to go back to the Pacific War, where distance was an enemy before the Japanese ever appeared. The Pacific did not fight like other battlefields. It did not offer neat front lines. It did not give pilots the comfort of roads, villages, church steeples, or rivers that could guide them home. It spread the war across distances that seemed designed to break men and machines before combat even began. From New Guinea to the Solomons, from muddy strips hacked out of jungle to coral runways on islands that barely rose above the sea, the air war was fought across a geography that punished every assumption. A mission might begin before dawn with mechanics working by flashlight, pilots drinking bad coffee from tin cups, and intelligence officers pointing at maps that made impossible distances look simple. On paper, a line from one airfield to another looked clean. In the cockpit, it became hours of heat, noise, glare, and uncertainty. The P-38 Lightning looked like the answer to this war. It was unlike almost anything else in the sky. Twin engines, twin booms, a central cockpit, heavy guns concentrated in the nose. No need for wing-mounted weapons to converge at a single distance. When a P-38 fired, its bullets and cannon shells went straight where the nose was pointed. To a young pilot facing Japanese aircraft, that mattered. It had speed. It had range. It could climb. It could absorb damage that might have destroyed a single-engine fighter. And in a theater where water filled the spaces between everything, two engines gave a kind of psychological comfort. One engine might still bring you home. Might. That word lived in every pilot's mind. Because the P-38 was not a miracle without cost. It was complicated. It demanded care. It required fuel, maintenance, proper engine handling, and pilots who understood its strengths and refused to fight like the enemy wanted them to fight. Its power was real, but it had to be managed. Its reach was real, but it had limits. And in the Pacific, limits were found quickly. Airfields were often primitive. Rain turned ground into mud. Heat punished engines before takeoff. Salt air corroded metal. Spare parts arrived late. Mechanics improvised because the supply chain could not always keep pace with the war. Every mission consumed machines that were already tired. Every landing beat landing gear against rough strips. Every takeoff sent aircraft into weather that could change from clear sky to black wall in minutes. The men at headquarters had charts. The men on the flight line had consequences. Command believed in systems. They had to. A war involving thousands of aircraft could not be run by instinct alone. There had to be standards for maintenance, fuel consumption, engine settings, climb procedures, emergency procedures, and combat formations. Without rules, chaos would kill as surely as the enemy. But the Southwest Pacific revealed the weakness of distant certainty. Factory tests did not fully capture the heat rising from a jungle strip. Maintenance manuals did not feel the exhaustion of a crew chief who had worked through the night patching battle damage. Fuel tables did not show the fear in a pilot's throat when he looked down and saw the gauge lower than expected while still too far from home. The P-38 could reach farther than many fighters, but the war kept asking it to reach farther still. Escort bombers, intercept raids, sweep enemy airfields, cover landings, hunt transports, push toward Rabaul, push toward the Philippines, push deeper, always deeper, as the Allied advance crawled across the map. Each mile added pressure. Each minute over the target burned fuel that might be needed later. A pilot could not simply fight until the sky was clear. He had to fight while doing arithmetic in his head. How much fuel remained? How far to base? Was there a closer strip? What if weather closed in? What if one engine failed? What if the enemy appeared during the return? This was the hidden war inside the air war. Not just bullets and courage, but endurance. And endurance was where official assumptions began to crack. The men who wrote restrictions did not want engines destroyed. They did not want aircraft lost because someone had decided to experiment. But the pilots facing Japanese fighters knew that an aircraft preserved too carefully might arrive too late, leave too soon, or fail to dominate the fight. A safe setting that left a pilot powerless at the critical moment was not truly safe. Across the Pacific, men began to learn the difference between what a machine was designed to do and what war demanded from it. The Japanese understood something too. They knew their aircraft, especially the Zero, could be deadly if the fight became slow, close, and turning. They knew American fighters could be lured into mistakes. They knew young pilots, eager to prove themselves, could be tempted into the kind of combat where agility mattered more than firepower. So the question became larger than engines. Could American pilots learn to fight the Pacific as it really was, rather than as commanders imagined it from charts and manuals? Could the P-38 become not just a long-range fighter, but a weapon shaped by the hard experience of the men who flew and maintained it? On paper, the Lightning had the reach and the guns. But in combat, one false assumption nearly handed the advantage back to the Zero. At the start, many Americans wanted to believe the problem was simple. The Japanese Zero was light. The American fighters were tougher. The Zero lacked armor and self-sealing fuel tanks in many versions. American aircraft carried heavier weapons, stronger structures, and engines built for power. Put enough brave men in the air, give them good machines, and courage would do the rest. That belief was comforting. It was also dangerous. The Zero was not merely an airplane. It was a trap for the impatient. In the right conditions, it could turn with frightening ease. It could seem to float through maneuvers that made heavier fighters bleed speed. A pilot who chased it into a turning fight could feel, for a few seconds, that he was close to victory. The enemy was right there, sliding across the gun sight. Just a little more pressure on the stick, just one more turn, just one more chance. Then the American aircraft slowed. The advantage vanished. The Zero tightened. The fight reversed. The hunter became the target. This was how false confidence killed. Not all at once, and not always dramatically. Sometimes it happened through a series of small decisions made under pressure. A pilot turned too long, climbed too steeply, forgot his altitude, ignored his speed, followed the enemy down, or stayed in the fight after fuel and engine temperatures told him to leave. In the cockpit, there was no time for theory. Combat arrived as flashes. A glint above the cloud line. A voice over the radio, clipped and strained. Tracers crossing from the left. A dark shape flicking through sunlight. The hard shove of G-force. The sudden smell of cordite after firing. The sickening sight of another aircraft trailing smoke. For young pilots, the sky could become a place of confusion almost instantly. Training told them what to do. Veterans told them what not to do. But fear and adrenaline had their own language. A pilot saw the enemy and wanted to press. He wanted to prove he belonged. He wanted to show he was not afraid. He wanted to kill. That desire could be fatal. The P-38 was powerful, but it was not meant to fight like a Zero. Its strength lay in speed, altitude, concentrated firepower, and coordinated attacks. It could strike hard, break away, climb, return, and strike again. It could use its engines and guns to dictate the fight. But if dragged into a slow-turning contest, it could become vulnerable. Command sometimes misunderstood this. Not because officers were stupid, but because war changes faster than doctrine. Reports arrived late. Lessons were paid for in lives before they became official procedure. What one squadron learned in blood might take too long to reach another. And the men at the top often preferred simple explanations, better discipline, better aggression, better use of existing tactics. But the pilots knew the truth was more precise. The P-38 did not simply need brave men. It needed men who could resist the enemy's invitation. That was harder than it sounded. Imagine a patrol over New Guinea. The Lightnings are moving through bright air, the jungle below broken by rivers and smoke from distant shelling. The pilots are hot, tired, already watching fuel. Then Japanese fighters appear. At first, the Americans have altitude. They dive. The first pass is violent and fast. Guns hammer. A Zero breaks away, smoke flickering near its wing root. Then the fight begins to spread. One pilot follows too far. Another loses sight of his wingman. A third sees a Zero below and rolls after it. The formation stretches. The clean geometry of the attack dissolves into individual survival. The Japanese pilots know this moment. They are waiting for it. They turn. They climb at angles that seem impossible. They bait the heavier aircraft downward. They make the Americans choose between discipline and desire. A pilot sees a Zero cross his nose. He pulls harder. His airspeed drops. The engines strain. The aircraft shudders. For one terrible second, he realizes he has entered the enemy's fight. This was the Pacific lesson. The Zero could not always be beaten by courage because courage was exactly what the Zero exploited. The answer was not fearlessness. It was control, patience, engine management, formation integrity, knowing when not to turn, knowing when to let the enemy go because living to strike again mattered more than one reckless shot. And beneath all of this was the question of range and performance. A pilot low on fuel became predictable. A pilot worried about engine temperature hesitated. A pilot forced to leave early surrendered initiative. Every mechanical limitation shaped tactical behavior. Every gallon mattered. Every setting mattered. Every unauthorized adjustment, if it worked, might mean the difference between entering combat with choices or entering it already trapped. This is what headquarters struggled to see. They saw aircraft as equipment. The pilots saw them as bargaining chips with death. The P-38 could be magnificent, but only if it was flown and maintained according to the realities of the theater, not just the rules of the manual. And slowly, on rough airstrips far from comfortable offices, another belief began to form. Maybe the answer would not come from a new fighter. Maybe it would come from a small change made by men tired of watching good pilots disappear. The turning point did not announce itself. There was no parade. No official memo declaring that the old assumptions had failed. No general standing before a map and admitting that the men on the flight line had seen the truth first. Instead, there was a mechanic crouched under an engine cowling. There was a flashlight beam trembling against metal. There were hands working carefully around parts that could kill a pilot if handled wrong. In wartime stories, the ace often receives the spotlight. His name goes on the victory board. His photograph appears beside the aircraft. His score becomes a number people remember. But before any fighter becomes legendary, someone has to make it ready. Someone has to tighten the bolts. Someone has to listen to the engine's uneven cough and know what it means. Someone has to decide whether a strange sound is harmless or fatal. The mechanics in the Pacific lived in that world. They were not clean. They were not rested. They did not work in ideal conditions. They worked in heat, rain, mud, and insects. They worked with shortages, damaged tools, late parts, and aircraft that came back full of holes. They watched pilots climb out laughing too loudly because they were trying not to shake. They watched others fail to come back at all. And every missing aircraft became a question. Could something have been done? That question is where innovation begins. The so-called forbidden fix was not simply about making an engine stronger. It was about breaking the assumption that safety lived only inside official limits. At headquarters, unauthorized modification meant danger. At the front, unchanged procedure could also mean danger. The same word, safety, meant different things depending on where a man stood. A general might look at a modification and see risk to equipment. A crew chief might look at it and see a pilot's chance to reach home. That did not make command foolish. Engines are unforgiving. A bad idea can destroy a machine faster than enemy fire. A pilot who believes a field trick makes him invincible is already halfway to disaster. Every aircraft in wartime is part of a system, and systems collapse when everyone improvises without discipline. But war is also a contest of adaptation. The Japanese had adapted. American pilots had adapted. The environment had forced adaptation. The question was whether official authority could adapt quickly enough. Sometimes it could not. So the men closest to the aircraft began making choices that lived in the gray zone between obedience and necessity. New engine settings, leaner mixtures, different ways of managing manifold pressure and revolutions, small adjustments that could stretch fuel, reduce waste, and give the P-38 more endurance across impossible distances. In stories retold later, the details might become sharper, more dramatic. A wire, a valve, a bypass, a trick that officers had banned until combat results made it impossible to ignore. Whatever the exact form, the emotional truth remained the same. The aircraft had to be taught how to survive the Pacific. Picture the scene. It is early morning. The jungle is still dark beyond the edge of the strip. The air smells of wet earth, fuel, and metal. AP-38 sits with its nose pointed toward a runway patched together by engineers who have been working almost as hard as the combat crews. Beneath one engine, two mechanics speak in low voices. They do not want unnecessary attention. They are not cowards. They are not reckless boys looking for trouble. They are men who have seen enough official confidence fail in the face of distance. One of them checks the adjustment again. The other looks toward the tents. A staff officer could appear at any moment. A question could become an order. An order could ground the aircraft. A grounded aircraft might mean one fewer fighter over the target. One fewer fighter might mean one bomber formation left exposed. In war, even small decisions cast long shadows. The pilot arrives. He knows something has changed. Maybe he asked for it. Maybe he only agreed to try it. Maybe he trusts the crew chief more than the paperwork. That trust is intimate in a way civilians rarely understand. A pilot may receive medals, but he places his life in the hands of men whose names history often forgets. He climbs in. The engines start. Everyone listens. A healthy engine has a rhythm. Mechanics know it. Pilots feel it. When something is wrong, the sound seems to catch in the chest before the mind can name it. On this morning, the engines settle. The vibration comes through the airframe. The pilot checks instruments. The crew chief watches his face. No explosion. No failure. Not yet. The aircraft taxis. It is easy, decades later, to call such an act innovation. In the moment, it may have felt like disobedience. And disobedience in wartime carries weight. It threatens hierarchy. It challenges the idea that those with rank understand best. It asks whether survival can justify breaking rules written for survival. That was the forbidden question. When the Lightning lifted from the strip, the answer did not come immediately. It would not be decided by theory. It would not be decided by argument. The test would happen at altitude, against Japanese pilots who had no interest in American regulations. Thomas McGuire did not become a legend because the Pacific was easy. He became one because it was not. By the time his name was spoken with awe among American airmen, the air war had already hardened everyone who survived it. The young men who arrived eager and clean were changed by the theater. They learned to sleep through engine noise and wake instantly at the sound of a scramble. They learned that a man could be joking over breakfast and gone by afternoon. They learned that the sky, so beautiful from the ground, could become a place of sudden fire and final silence. McGuire flew the P-38 Lightning with the kind of aggression that made commanders value him and made danger follow him closely. He was not simply a pilot collecting victories. He was a man operating inside pressure that grew with every success. Each enemy aircraft destroyed added to his reputation. Each reputation created expectation. Each expectation pushed him back into the sky. The numbers made him famous, but they also narrowed the path around him. The Lightning suited men like him because it rewarded boldness controlled by skill. Its nose guns could tear through an enemy aircraft in a single accurate burst. Its speed allowed it to strike before the enemy fully understood what was happening. Its twin engines gave it reach across the Pacific's cruel distances. But it demanded judgment. It was not a forgiving aircraft when mishandled at low speed or low altitude. It could not be treated like a zero. It could not be thrown into every turn without consequence. McGuire understood that combat was not a duel of romance. It was geometry, energy, timing, fear, and violence compressed into seconds. Now imagine a mission in the Southwest Pacific. The briefing room is hot. Men stand around a map, some listening carefully, others staring at nothing because they have heard enough briefings to know that the map never shows the whole truth. The route is long. The enemy may appear near the target or on the return. Weather is uncertain. Fuel will matter. Engine handling will matter. Discipline will matter. Outside, the P-38s wait. Their twin booms cast long shadows. Ground crews move around them with practiced urgency. Ammunition is loaded. Fuel caps are secured. Oil is checked. The aircraft look powerful, but every man there knows power can be fragile. McGuire climbs into his cockpit. The canopy closes. The world narrows. The formation lifts into the morning and turns toward enemy territory. For a long time, there is only the sound of engines and the endless Pacific below. This is where the P-38's endurance matters. Not in a dramatic instant, but in the long minutes when nothing happens and everything is being spent. Fuel burns. Engines work. Pilots scan the sky until their eyes ache. Then the enemy appears. At first, perhaps, they are specks. Then wings. Then movement. Japanese fighters climbing, turning, spreading. The radio sharpens. A voice calls position. Another voice answers. The formation tightens. The fight begins quickly. A P-38 dives. The Japanese break. A Zero turns hard, trying to pull the heavier fighter into a slow contest. But the Lightning does not accept the invitation. It comes through fast, guns firing from the nose, then pulls away before the turn can trap it. Another pass. Another burst. Smoke. A falling shape. This is not luck. It is doctrine rewritten by survival. Speed instead of turning. Patience instead of ego. Engine management instead of blind aggression. Range enough to arrive with options. Power enough to decide when to fight and when to leave. Here, the earlier argument becomes real. The unauthorized adjustment, the altered procedure, the field expedient wisdom of mechanics and pilots. None of it wins the battle alone. No modification can aim the guns. No engine setting can replace courage. No wire or valve can teach a pilot when to break off. But a small advantage at the right moment can decide whether skill has room to work. If a pilot can stay longer, he can cover a friend. If he can preserve fuel, he can choose the return instead of praying for it. If the engines respond when needed, he can climb, dive, escape, or attack. And in the Pacific, choice was life. McGuire's victories were not clean marks on a board. Each one came out of noise, pressure, and risk. Each one meant another Japanese pilot had also faced his last seconds in a cockpit. The war in the air can look elegant from far away. Aircraft turning against clouds, silver wings flashing in sunlight. Up close, it was brutal. Men burned. Engines exploded. Aircraft fell into jungle or sea where no grave could be marked. That is the part numbers hide. When McGuire's score climbed, the official argument began to weaken. Results have a way of silencing theory. A band method that fails is called reckless. A band method that works becomes difficult to condemn. Command could still worry about maintenance discipline. They could still warn against overconfidence. But they could no longer ignore what was happening in the sky. The P-38, flown correctly and adapted to the Pacific, was not merely surviving. It was becoming feared. For the Japanese pilots who once counted on American mistakes, something had changed. The Lightnings were no longer always taking the bait. They were striking harder, staying longer, and refusing to fight stupidly. When the kill numbers began to rise, the argument moved beyond one pilot and one modified aircraft. The enemy began to feel the change. Reputation moves strangely in war. It travels through official reports, intercepted radio traffic, prisoner interrogations, rumors in mess tents, and the private fear of men who survive one battle only to be sent into another. An aircraft becomes more than metal. A squadron becomes more than a unit designation. A pilot becomes more than a name. In the Pacific, the P-38 began to acquire a presence. Japanese pilots had learned to respect many American machines, but the Lightning presented a particular problem. It could come from distance. It could appear where shorter-range fighters might not. It carried concentrated firepower. It could hit hard and leave before a Zero could force the kind of fight it wanted. The old expectation had been simple: draw the Americans into turns. Make them impatient. Use agility against weight. Use experience against aggression. But the Lightnings that survived long enough to learn became different enemies. They did not always chase. They did not always turn. They came in fast, fired, climbed, and returned. They worked in pairs and flights. They learned to protect each other. They learned that discipline in the air was not the same thing as obedience on the ground. One was about surviving the enemy. The other could sometimes become a delay in understanding him. The Japanese pilots felt that shift, not all at once, not as a single moment of revelation. War rarely grants such clarity. Instead, it came through repeated encounters. A formation that expected to lure P-38s into a low-turning fight found them staying high. A pilot who counted on outmaneuvering a heavier aircraft found himself attacked from above and behind. A base that seemed beyond routine fighter reach heard engines overhead. This is how battlefield reality destroys belief, not through argument, but repetition. Again and again, the assumption failed. Again and again, the enemy did not behave as expected. The wider consequences reached beyond dogfights. If P-38s could escort bombers farther, Japanese bases were more vulnerable. If they could stay longer over contested airspace, Allied operations gained breathing room. If experienced pilots could combine endurance, speed, and tactical discipline, the Japanese air arm faced pressure it could not easily replace. By this stage of the war, Japan was already struggling with a problem America did not share in the same way: the loss of trained pilots. A veteran fighter pilot is not built quickly. He is made through fuel, time, instructors, aircraft, and survival. Every experienced pilot lost created a gap that could not be filled by courage alone. The Americans were learning under fire. The Japanese were losing men who had already learned. That imbalance mattered. And behind the combat reports, the mechanics kept working. This is where the story widens. Because the legend of one ace can make history look individual, as if one man's courage bent the war. But the Pacific Air War was a machine made of thousands of people. Pilots, crew chiefs, armorers, engineers, radio operators, meteorologists, fuel handlers, runway builders, intelligence officers, medics, clerks, cooks, and exhausted men who dragged pierced aircraft off strips before the next landing. McGuire's 38 victories belonged to his skill and aggression. But they also belonged to the ecosystem that put him in the air. A P-38 could not fight if a mechanic missed a crack. It could not reach the target if fuel planning failed. It could not find the enemy if intelligence was wrong. It could not return if the runway was cratered. No ace flew alone, even in a single-seat cockpit. That is one reason the forbidden modification matters as a symbol. It reminds us that wars are not always changed by the clean decisions of senior commanders. Sometimes they are changed by people near the problem. A mechanic who knows an engine's behavior better than a staff officer. A pilot who understands that one more minute of range might save a formation. A squadron that learns faster than the doctrine writers. What they believed was that unauthorized change threatened order. What reality exposed was that order without adaptation could become its own form of danger. Still, success carried its own trap. When a field method works, men may begin to trust it too much. When an aircraft becomes feared, pilots may ask more of it. When an ace becomes famous, he may feel the invisible pressure to keep performing at the edge of possibility. The Lightning was powerful, but it was not invincible. No machine was. No pilot was. The Japanese were not passive targets. They adapted too. They set traps, changed tactics, used weather and altitude, attacked the vulnerable moments of takeoff, landing, escort, and return. Every American advantage forced a Japanese response. Every mission remained a negotiation with chance. And chance was merciless. The same confidence that allowed pilots to dominate the sky could also bring them closer to catastrophe. In a world where seconds decided life or death, the line between boldness and fatal error was sometimes too thin to see until after it had been crossed. McGuire, like every great combat pilot, lived near that line. The legend grew. The danger grew with it. There is a silence that settles over an airfield when aircraft are overdue. It is different from ordinary quiet. Men still move. Tools still clink. Radios still crackle. Someone still walks from tent to tent carrying messages. But the whole place seems to listen. A mission is expected back. The time comes. A few aircraft appear, then more. Engines drone in the distance. Men shade their eyes and count silhouettes. One lands with damage. Another comes in low, trailing smoke. A pilot climbs out slowly and says little. Ground crews look past him, toward the sky, waiting for the others. Sometimes the others do not come. This was the cost behind every victory board. The public saw numbers. Pilots saw faces. The number 38, attached to Thomas McGuire, became part of American air war legend. It placed him among the greatest fighter aces the United States ever produced. It marked him as extraordinary. But numbers have a way of hardening human experience into something too clean. 38 victories does not tell you about the weather. It does not tell you about the missions that ended with hands shaking too badly to unbuckle easily. It does not tell you about the enemy pilot trapped in a burning aircraft. It does not tell you about the friend who vanished into cloud and never answered the radio again. And it does not tell you what happens inside a man when survival becomes reputation. The closer McGuire came to legend, the more he carried. There was rivalry, ambition, duty, pride, and the unspoken expectation that great pilots would do great things again and again. In wartime, success does not release a man from danger. It sends him back into it. This is one of the cruelest truths of combat. The better a man becomes, the more valuable he is. The more valuable he is, the more he is used. The more he is used, the more often chance gets to try its hand. For fighter pilots, death was not always dramatic in the way movies imagine. Sometimes it came from a mistake at low altitude. A moment of target fixation. A maneuver begun too slow. External tanks not released in time. A wingman in trouble. A split-second decision made with incomplete information. On January 7, 1945, McGuire died in the Philippines while trying to assist another pilot during combat. The details have been studied and retold. Low altitude, a dangerous maneuver, the burden of external tanks, an aircraft pushed beyond what the moment allowed. The man who had survived so many violent encounters was lost not because he lacked courage, but because courage itself can place a man in impossible positions. There is no need to exaggerate that ending. It is heavy enough. The Pacific did not care that he was famous. It did not care about his score. It did not care about the mechanics who had kept his aircraft flying, the pilots who admired him, the commanders who counted on him, or the newspapers that would print his name. At low altitude, physics was final. That is why the story of the forbidden fix cannot be told as a simple triumph. It is not a story where rule-breaking magically defeats the enemy. It is not a story where one modification turns a flawed war into a clean victory. The truth is harder and more human. Adaptation saved lives. Adaptation also encouraged men to keep flying into danger. The P-38 gave pilots reach, firepower, and options. Field wisdom made it more useful in a theater that punished every weakness. But no adjustment could remove fear from the cockpit. No engine setting could erase grief from an airfield. No victory score could guarantee one more safe return. In the evening, after a loss, the routine continued because war allowed no other choice. Mechanics cleaned tools. Armorers prepared ammunition. Fuel trucks moved. Pilots sat with cigarettes burning low between their fingers. Someone updated a board. Someone folded a blanket on an empty bunk. Someone wrote a letter that said less than it meant because there were no words strong enough for the truth. This is where documentary history must slow down. Because if we only tell the story through machines and victories, we miss the men. We miss the fear of the pilot who trusts a modification because the alternative is worse. We miss the mechanic who wonders whether his work helped save a life or pushed a machine closer to failure. We miss the commander caught between discipline and reality. We miss the enemy pilot, trained, frightened, determined, and just as mortal. The Pacific Air War was not a contest between myths. It was a collision of human beings inside machines at the edge of endurance. McGuire's story endures because it contains both brilliance and warning. He showed what skill, aggression, and adaptation could achieve. His death showed that no amount of success cancels the laws of war, gravity, and chance. In the end, the forbidden modification was never just about an engine. It was about the distance between command belief and battlefield truth. So what did they believe? They believed rules protected aircraft. They believed manuals preserved engines. They believed unauthorized modifications threatened discipline. They believed that control from above was the safest way to manage machines, men, and risk. And in many cases, they were right. A military cannot function if every pilot becomes his own engineer and every mechanic becomes his own design bureau. A fighter aircraft is a violent machine held together by precision. It does not forgive careless improvisation. Men in command had reasons for caution, and those reasons were not cowardly. They were responsible for lives, equipment, logistics, and the terrifying possibility that one bad idea could kill pilots before they ever reached the enemy. But what really happened was more complicated. The Pacific created conditions that no manual could fully anticipate. It stretched aircraft across distances that turned fuel into fate. It placed pilots against an enemy whose strengths punished impatience and exposed tactical ignorance. It forced mechanics to solve problems with limited tools and no time. It made every mission a test not only of courage, but of adaptation. The men at the front saw the truth first because they lived inside it. They saw the fuel gauges. They heard the engines cough. They watched damaged aircraft land. They counted the missing. They knew that a rule written to prevent disaster could become dangerous when reality changed faster than policy. That is the heart of this story. The forbidden fix, whether remembered as a wire, a valve, altered engine settings, or a broader culture of field adaptation, matters because it represents a deeper pattern in war. Victory often depends on people who are close enough to failure to understand it clearly. Not always the highest-ranking people. Not always the most celebrated. Sometimes the person who changes the fight is a crew chief under a wing at dawn, a pilot willing to question procedure, or a civilian expert showing combat pilots that their aircraft can do more if handled differently. The P-38 Lightning did not become effective in the Pacific because it was perfect. It became effective because men learned how to make its strengths matter. They learned not to fight the zero on the zero's terms. They learned that range was not just a specification, but a weapon. They learned that endurance could shape tactics. They learned that the difference between official performance and battlefield performance could be measured in lives. And men like Thomas McGuire turned those lessons into results written across the sky in fire, smoke, and wreckage. But the ending remains sobering. Because the same war that rewards adaptation also consumes the people who adapt. The same aircraft that carries a pilot to victory may carry him to his final mistake. The same confidence that wins fights may one day push too far. War does not give permanent exemptions to heroes. That is why this story belongs to Warfront Archive. Because it is not only about what men built. It is about what they believed and what reality forced them to understand. At the beginning, an unauthorized change looked like disobedience, a risk, a violation of order, something to ban before it spread. By the end, it looked different. It looked like a symptom of a battlefield moving faster than command. It looked like the front line speaking in the only language war respects: results. It looked like men refusing to let procedure become a coffin. Return now to that first P-38 on the strip. The morning heat rising. The mechanics stepping back. The pilot alone under glass. The engines turning on either side of him, each one a promise and a threat. Headquarters has its rules. The enemy has his tactics. The Pacific has its distances. And somewhere ahead, Japanese fighters are waiting. The Lightning rolls forward. Dust erupts behind the wheels. For a moment, everything depends on trust. Trust in the engines. Trust in the hands that prepared them. Trust in the judgment of men who dared to question whether the official answer was enough. Then the aircraft lifts, not into myth, into war. And the question remains with us long after the engine's sound fades. Was it reckless disobedience? Or was it the kind of battlefield genius that only looks illegal until it works? Tell us what you think below. And if you want more stories of what they believed and what really happened, subscribe to WW2 Warfront.